Hi everyone, this is Nathan from Snap and welcome to another of our Snap XMP webinars. Today we're going to be looking at the analysis in Snap and we're going to be focusing on producing tables today. In next month's webinar we'll be looking more towards the building of charts. Now when it comes to the results or the analysis of a project, this can mean very different things to different people. For many people it's a case of simply taking your data and giving it to someone in Excel or CSV format. But is this analysis? It is data and it is indeed the answers to your questions, but it is just a list of numbers and comments. Are we assuming that the person who will be receiving this CSV data knows what to do with it? Does this person understand the structure of your questionnaire, with questions maybe being skipped over due to survey logic or routing? Is it obvious which questions are single response questions or multiple response questions? So as you can see, there's a very real danger that this important data will be misinterpreted. So what can we do to help? In short, we can tabularize your data or chart your data, pointing people to the key information. We can use tables to compare results for different areas or different demographics, ordering the data to make it easier to read, and also filtering out or perhaps filtering in key areas of focus. As well as providing useful information to your colleagues and clients, producing your analysis in Snap also has the key benefit of the data always being up to date. If instead you're exporting your data and producing your tables and charts outside of Snap, these tables and charts only contain the data that was available at that time of export. In Snap, you can build your tables and charts before your project has even gone live, and then they will be updated as and when your data trickles in. Okay, let's head into the software to make a start. I'm going to be using the in-crowd conference survey, which many of you may be familiar with if you've already been listening in on our recent webinars. It's about a group of attendees at a conference and contains a number of different types of questions. You can see there's 160 cases or 160 people have responded. So if we were to export this into Excel, for example, we simply have 160 rows of data. But today we're going to pick out a few questions and look to build some tables. So I'll just go into the survey itself. I'm viewing this in Snap Desktop at the moment. And I'll just do a quick preview just to give you an idea of some of the questions in the survey. So I've got to publish and I'll just do a preview only. So within the survey, we've got a number of different types of questions. We've got some simple yes/no type single choice questions. We've got some multiple response questions. This one's actually a map control where they can choose more than one answer. Most surveys tend to have some sort of satisfaction type question in there. So we'll be looking at that one quite a bit. And we've also got some multiple response questions where they can choose as many options as they wish. And there's also a comment question and a numerical sort of spend question, which we'll be looking at later. So a little bit of everything, and we'll look to sort of pull out some key questions from our analysis. And at the end, there's also a multiple response, single response. When did you attend the conference? But we're going to head back into the actual software itself. And we can close down the questionnaire design window. And it might be useful to keep the list of variables open just to remind yourself of what all the different questions are. We can actually drag these into our tables and charts if you like easier later, but to be honest, it's probably just as easy to type them in. And across the top, I've got my tables icon and my charts icon. So we're just going to go into the tables to begin with. So this is where we start building our tables and charts. You can see my cursor's already on the analysis, and we've got the analysis and break. Now, for those of you that are perhaps a bit more used to using Excel, the analysis and break is just the equivalent of your X and Y axes. Now, if I just quickly pop back into my PowerPoint, I've got an example table up here, and so you can see I've got an age question and a gender question. So on the left hand side, the analysis, if you use an Excel, that's your x-axis. So we've got rows of data going across the page, and then the break is your y-axis, and we've got columns of data going down. So my gender question, the rows of data are going down, so we always break down. But analysis and break is just the equivalent of X and Y. So if we go back to the software, it's just a case of popping your question numbers into the analysis and break. So I'm going to start off with question 2, which is just how often have you attended? So I'll leave everything else as it is by default and just click apply. So really simple table, 68 people have responded to this question, and this is how they've all responded. You may wish to break this data down to compare the data between perhaps different areas or different demographics. So under the break, I can pop my age question in, which is question 15, and again just simply click apply. So now we can see of the 68 people the different breakdown for the different age categories. Now in my example today I've got 6 different age categories. You can use something called a derived variable to recategorize these and sort of simplify your data. So I have a derived variable called age, which is basically grouping these different categories together. And if I click apply, you can see I then have the same data, but in smaller categories. So it's a way of sort of simplifying your analysis. On the right hand side, we've got options to say, do we want just the count, so just the number of people, or do we also want percent options? And you can see there's 3 to choose from, but again, it just comes down to, do you want your rows of data or your columns of data to be calculating percentages? So remember, analysis means across. So each row will add up to 100% now. So of my 10 people who stayed once before, 20% were in the age group of 16 to 35, 50% were 36 to 55, and 30% were 65 or 56 plus. If on the other hand, I wanted to know of the 56 plus age group, how often do they tend to stay? Then we'd need to calculate the columns, so it's the break percents. Okay, so nice and easy to chop and change what you're looking at. If I just save, I'm going to pop it back to analysis percents and click OK and save. You can see that gives it a default name of AN1, which just stands for analysis number 1. We'll look at that one again in just a second, but for the time being, I'll close that one down. If I then open up a new table, and this time I'm going to look at one of the multiple response questions. So we've got question number 7, which is which facilities did we use? So I said you could actually drag it across if you wish. And again, if I click apply, so here people can choose as many options as they like. So 119 people went to the breakout rooms, 115 people made use of the car park, etc. But there's a number of different things we can do to focus on the key information here. So at the moment you can see it's in the order of how the survey is actually set up, which was alphabetically. From an analysis point of view, quite often you might wish to order it in terms of the actual data. Again, you may want to maybe focus on perhaps the most popular items and not worry about the items which weren't so popular. So rather than displaying all the data, we have the option of showing the top rows. And I'm going to say I want the top 5 categories, but if you just notice that I have actually got a joint category or joint top 5. So when I click apply, it will automatically show the top 5. Just being a little bit careful because there was also one called first 5. So that will literally take the first 5 rows and it won't take into consideration the actual data. So in my case, top rows is probably what I was looking for. So that's how to pick out perhaps the top 5. Alternatively, if I pop that back to all and put it back to its original order, there may be a need for you to pick and choose certain categories. So alternatively, in brackets, I could pick out the key categories that I was interested in. So option number 1 being the breakout rooms, comma 3, which is the concierge, and then perhaps I might jump from number 6 through to 9. Again, close that bracket and click apply. And it's just a way of removing information which is perhaps background noise and perhaps information that you don't really need to be focusing on. Okay, but I'm going to pop that back just to the Q7 and I'll leave it ordered top to bottom and the top 5. I'll just save that again. So we've looked at a single choice question, we've looked at a multiple response question, and we've also looked at sort of adding in the sort of age question. Let's now focus on a rating scale question. So today we have question 5A, B and C and D, which is basically what did you think of the speakers today on a scale of very good to very poor, and the workshops on a scale of very good to very poor. So again, I'm going to say I want everything from question 5 tilde question 5D, tilde being the equivalent of me using the word to. So if I apply that one to begin with, so this will lay the table out very much like the original questionnaire, with the list of sub questions down the side and the very good to very poor across the top. Just from a formatting point of view, we have got a style drop down available, and within the style drop down we've got a number of different styles available. You can see there's a list there. I can actually click on select, and what that will do is give me a small sort of preview window of what these different tables and charts might look like. You can see there's a couple of ones with shades on, etc. But I'm going to cancel back out of there. These are grid questions, so I'm going to apply the grid table to it, which, just to confirm, that the table styles don't change the data at all. It's all about formatting. So it hasn't made a massive difference. It's just removed some of the unnecessary grid lines and a couple of words which weren't needed. But as I said, in terms of different styles, we give you a few to choose from. Ultimately, you can right click and make your own edits as well. So making individual edits to different areas. You can see we've got the sort of main body in the side, we've got the labels at the side, we've got the code labels at the top. So going into edit styles allows you to make individual edits, and then you can save those styles for your future use. But I'm going to pop it back just to the standard grid table. Again, at this stage we might decide to pop percentages on. So I'm going to choose analysis percent. So of the 156 people who spoke about the venue, this is what they had to say. Rather than if I had it on break, we'd be saying of the 221 people who said this was very good, these are the things that they said it was very good about. But in this example, probably analysis percent makes a bit more sense. We've also got the option to filter your data. So in my survey today, I have question number 1, which is have you attended before? So if I was to say Q1 equals 1, so 1 being the first answer, you can see it does tell me at the top what that actually means. So these are the people who have attended before. Whilst if I say Q1 equals 2, these are the people who've not attended before. Okay. Other things we could do, you can see when I save my table, it's been naming it as AN1 or AN2, analysis number 1, analysis number 2. In a moment, we're going to look at all the tables that I've just saved, and looking at a big list of AN1 to AN perhaps 20 can be a little bit misleading and a bit confusing at times. So personally, I would name my tables manually. So I call my tables T, and I'm going to call it T5, just so I know that this one's based on a table and it's table number 5, a table based on question number 5, sorry. If I save that, I could then go back to my saved tables and charts that we did earlier. So across the top, we've got our saved analyses. So there's the original tables I produced, AM1 and AM2. So again, at this stage, I'm going to double click on AM1. It will open back up, and at the same time, it will be looking at the very latest data. So if I clicked on this tomorrow, then perhaps there might be 75 people or 80 people in total. But if I now go into the properties, and again, I'm just going to name that as T for table, and perhaps age, so I know that it's a table based on question 2 and it's broken down by age. Again, I'll name AN2 as well, and I might call that perhaps T for table 7, but perhaps ordered. Okay, so it'll make your life a lot easier, particularly if you're giving access to colleagues and clients to these tables and charts a bit later, if they've got more sensible names. But I'm going to just go back into T5. There is a lot more that we could do to this table. For example, we could group together the positive answers at one end and perhaps the negative answers at the other. We could introduce perhaps a derived variable which turns this 5-point scale into maybe a 3-point scale of positive, neutral, negative. We could also add a scoring system, so we could allocate perhaps 5 points to very good and 4 points to good, all the way down to 1 point, and then add and then present an average score across the different categories. So yeah, a lot more that you can do with the analysis side of things, particularly with your sort of rating scale questions. Now I'm going to have a quick look at an open style question, looking at a quantity response question. And we're going to look at question 8, which was how much did you spend in the restaurant? So initially I'm going to pop that back to just the default table again, and we'll look at question 8 and apply that one. Now, by default, Snap is attempting to cluster these into categories. So it's looked at the 158 responses, and in the background it's worked out that these are different categories, sort of bundles. So 28 people have spent around that much, 46 people have spent around about that much. But if I was to go into auto coding, you can see for quantity response, I said the default is clusters. Alternatively, I could set that to values. And that will tell me that 3 people spent £2, 1 person spent £3, 2 people spent £98, etc. But what we're going to do today is set that to none. And what that will do is just do initially is tell us that there's 158 people who answered that question. If I now go into definition, and what I'm going to do is make use of the drop down menu under the break and choose statistics table. And if I apply that one. Now, the first issue we have is that the data is scrolling off the page out into the car park. So if you remember, it's the analysis and break which dictates whether things go across the page or down the page. So we could retype these back to front, or it's much easier just to transpose it. So that essentially switches the columns and rows over. Makes it a little bit easier to read. But you can see in this example, what it does do is present us with some quite, well, potentially obscure numbers depending on what you're into. But if I go into descriptive statistics, we then have the option to add or remove items from this table. So I'm going to remove some of these options at the bottom, just going to double click on them and move them away. I want to get rid of the quartiles, for example. Probably don't need 13 decimal places, so I'll apply that one. And we're then left with potentially a smaller amount of information, which is perhaps more meaningful to whoever's going to be viewing this data. If I go back to the definition tab, again, we might want to make use of the different styles. And you notice there's a statistics table, but there's also a statistics table transposed. So occasionally there are a couple of different similar sounding styles available, and they're basically designed to work with the fact that if you transpose a table or chart and there's an equivalent transpose style, then choose that style, because particularly with tables, it's more to do with which grid lines are on display. Whilst if I was to take the transpose off and make it go across, you can see the grid lines don't quite work out. So now if I choose the table style, which is just called statistics table, and you can see the grid lines work much better. So in table styles in particular, the styling is more to do with what grid lines are on display. Okay, but as I said, just to reiterate, the actual table style has nothing to do with the actual underlying data in the background. Now, again, we could do a lot more with this type of question. Again, for example, we could introduce a derived variable which manually clusters these up. So a bit like when we went into this table to begin with, it automatically, or Snap tried to put it into categories by default, but a derived variable would allow us to perhaps put this into categories of those who maybe spent under £10, those who spent £10 to £20, etc. Okay, now before we look at these tables in fact, I'll just name that before I forget. Now, before we look at these tables in Snap Online, I'm going to go back and have a bit more of a look at how to filter your data. So I'm going to go back and produce a quick table based on question number 7. Again, I'll just pop that back to the default table. So today we have question number 16, which is which month did you attend? So I could say Q16 equals 1, and that will give me the data for anyone who attended in January. If I wanted to look at perhaps people who attended in maybe the first few months of the year, then I can pop that in brackets and say 1, 2, 3, 4. Alternatively, we could make use of the tilde. I could say everything between 1 to 4. Now, in my survey, I've actually got a question which is saying, there's a tick box question saying, when did you attend your event? It's quite likely you're not going to have an equivalent question like that, but you may have your own date response question, or if you haven't even got your own date response question, then you will automatically have the hidden id.date power data variable. And we can filter that like any open style question. So I can say id.date. And again, if we're just interested in a particular month, I can say equals 1 for January, or perhaps 12 for December. Again, I could say 1 to 3 for maybe January, February, March. Or if you're looking for a particular date range, then because it's an open style question and it's a date response question, I could say it's greater or equal to the 1st of March 22, and id.date is less than perhaps the 1st of May 22. So again, that's everyone who's arrived or filled in the survey, should I say, between that particular date range. Again, there is a lot more we can do with filtering, and at the end of this webinar I'm going to point you off to a couple of our previous webinars which are specifically around filtering for both analysis and routing. I'll take that filter off, and in fact I'm going to cancel that chart altogether. Okay, just to finish off, we're going to quickly pop into Snap Online to have a look at how your tables and charts might be accessed by colleagues or clients. Now, before I do log in, just to point out that any tables and charts that you save today will automatically be available in Snap Online. So if I go into my save tables and charts, you can see they all say yes next to them. If I didn't particularly want that chart to be visible for Snap Online, so I wanted to only view it in Snap Desktop, I could go into that chart or that table, back into properties, and at the bottom we have a drop down, and I can set that to no. Okay, so same with tables, charts and reports. You can either set them to yes, just a simple yes or no, Or, and again, I'm not going to be showing you how to do this today, but you've also got functionality of how you can set specific tables and charts to specific people. So you might have perhaps a manager which has access to certain tables and charts, whilst maybe perhaps the line manager or maybe a normal member of staff has access to a slightly different set of tables and charts. So it's all based on access levels. Okay, but today I'll leave that one set to no. So when I log in, hopefully you'll only be able to see those three. I'll just synchronize all the work I've been doing today, and then we will log into Snap Online. So here's my survey. Hopefully it hasn't timed out, but if I go into in fact, if I just refresh the screen initially, you can see that, yes, there's 3 tables available and 4 standardized reports. But if I go into Analyze, these are the 4 standardized reports which come built into each and every survey within Snap. And if we look at the tables and charts section, those are the 3 tables that we produced earlier. And again, just by simple clicking on them, same as in Desktop Snap, it will open up the tables or charts or reports, but it will be using the very latest data. Okay, so again, you can build all these tables and charts before the survey's even gone live, and then as the data trickles into the survey, it will be updating with the latest information. Down the bottom, you can see we got options for filters and context. This allows me to filter my data. So just like we did earlier, so again, I could say Q1 equals 1. Alternatively, if this is something you're going to be doing quite a lot of, or probably more likely that you're going to be perhaps giving access to colleagues and clients, access to these tables and charts, or maybe even reports, then we can set up what we call an external filter. So you can see I can click on the plus, and I've chosen a couple of key questions which I want to be able to filter by. So I might want to filter on venue. I click next. I can then say I just want the data for London and apply those changes. Likewise, in fact, if I take that one off just because I don't have too much data today, I could apply a different one, perhaps looking at the date question. And because it's, again, this is id.date, the open style question, I can actually pick a particular date range. So perhaps basically the month of August, and apply that one. Okay, so again, there is a lot more that we can do in Snap Online with regards to sharing these tables and charts, and there is more information available on our support hub how you do this, as well as some of our previous webinars, which you can also access via the support hub. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little introduction of how you can tablize your data within SnapXMP. Hopefully you've seen that it's nice and easy to build simple tables and charts, plotting multiple questions together, and also filtering your data as required. This really was the very tip of the iceberg in terms of the functionality available for building tables within Snap. As mentioned, next month we'll be doing the equivalent act of building charts. But on screen now, there are a couple of QR codes, which if you scan with your phone, they will take you off to some of our previous webinars, which focus on a lot more detail, for example, on the routing analysis expressions that we looked at. And there's a more detailed analysis overview webinar you could have a look at as well. Plus, there's a lot more information on our support hub overall. If you have got a spare 2 minutes, I'd be very grateful if you would complete our short survey just by scanning the QR code on the end. This can be accessed on your phone just by pointing your camera to it. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.